Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. A quiet room dimly lit by the afternoon sun slipping through the window. An old man lies in bed, his breath shallow, his body frail. On his cheek glistens a single tear, soft, silent, but heavier than 1,000 words. It is the last tear he will ever shed, a tear not of anger, not of resentment, but of love and of sorrow. That tear carries a story of sacrifice, of endless devotion, and of love so pure it is almost invisible because we take it for granted. It is the story of a parent's love, a love that begins before we even open our eyes to this world. A love that carried us through nights of sickness, through hunger, through storms of life we never even knew existed because someone was standing in front of us, shielding us with their body. But here is the painful truth. As children, we rarely notice. We grow up thinking we are the ones suffering, the ones struggling, the ones fighting for our place in the world. We forget that behind us stands a father with calloused hands and a mother with sleepless eyes. Two silent guardians who never once stopped giving, even when they had nothing left for themselves. And then one day they are gone. What's left behind is not their voice, not their embrace, but the hollow echo of everything we never said. The words thank you that stuck in our throats, the simple I love you that always felt like it could wait until tomorrow. But tomorrow has a cruel habit of running out. This is not just a story of one ungrateful son. It is the story of us all, because in some corner of our hearts, each of us has been careless with the love that raised us. We have turned away when they wanted to see our face. We have stayed silent when they longed to hear our voice. We have convinced ourselves that love unspoken can still be understood, forgetting that silence too can wound. Buddhist teachings remind us that life is impermanent like dewdrops on grass at dawn. By the time the morning sun rises, they vanish without a trace. Our parents' love is like that dew, delicate, shining, and fleeting. If we wait too long to notice, it slips through our fingers, leaving only regret. So listen closely. This is not just a tale to stir your emotions. It is a mirror. It asks us, when was the last time you truly looked into your parents' eyes? When was the last time you let gratitude flow through your words, instead of keeping it locked away in silence? The tear of regret is not shed by the parent who departs, but by the child who remains. The one who realizes too late that the greatest gift in life was there all along, wrapped not in ribbons, not in gold, but in sleepless nights and calloused hands, in soft lullabies and quiet sacrifices. And now, let us walk deeper into this story. A story where love was given without measure, and yet forgotten too easily. A story that will break your heart, so it can open your eyes. Imagine the first light of dawn breaking across a small village. The streets are still empty, the world still asleep, but one man is already awake. His body aches from yesterday's labor, yet he rises without complaint. His hands, rough and cracked, search for his tools. His heart, though weary, beats with only one purpose: to feed his child, to keep the little one safe, to carry a weight no one else will see. This is the story of a father, not the kind of father who speaks often or showers his children with words of affection. No, his love is quieter, almost invisible, like the steady rhythm of a heartbeat you only notice when it's gone. He expresses it in sweat, in sleepless nights, in the silent endurance of pain. Day after day, he bends his back under the scorching sun. He lifts burdens heavier than his body should bear, and each drop of sweat that falls to the ground is a promise that his child will never go hungry, never know the cold he has endured. But here is the tragedy: the child rarely sees it. To young eyes, the father is just a man who comes home tired, sometimes stern, sometimes silent. His hands are dirty, his clothes smell of soil, and his face is lined with fatigue. The child does not realize that those lines were carved by love, that every wrinkle is a testament to sacrifice. In Buddhist teachings, the father is often likened to a mountain, firm, steady, unmoving. The mountain does not announce its strength. It simply stands, carrying storms, sheltering life at its feet. That is what a father does. He absorbs hardship so his children can live more lightly. But as the years pass, the child grows blind to this silent sacrifice. The meals on the table seem ordinary, the roof overhead feels natural, schoolbooks appear as if by magic. Behind it all is a man whose body is breaking, yet whose spirit refuses to bend, because love gives him a strength that pain cannot steal. One evening the father returns home, his steps heavy, his breath shallow. He places his worn-out shoes by the door and sits in silence, watching his child eat the meal prepared with the last of his strength. He does not say, "I am tired." He does not complain that his back feels like it might snap. Instead, he smiles faintly, because the sight of his child eating fills him with joy that words could never hold. This is the love we often miss, the love that hides behind silence. We mistake it for distance, for coldness, not realizing it is the deepest devotion of all. And yet, as the story unfolds, we will see how easily such devotion can be forgotten. How easily a child, wrapped in their own world, can fail to recognize the mountain that carried them through every storm. The father's struggles are silent, but silence is not emptiness. Silence is love in its purest form. And once it is gone, the silence becomes unbearable. Let us look closer now, not just at the father's hands, but at the gentle heart that beats behind them. If a father's love is like a mountain, silent, steady, unshakable, then a mother's love is like the ocean, boundless and flowing, reaching every corner of a child's life. It is a love that begins before the first cry, before the first breath, when she carries life within her, enduring discomfort, pain, and fear with only one thought: may my child arrive safely into this world. From the very first moment a mother gives, her body is no longer her own, her sleep, her health, her time, all surrendered willingly. And when the child is born, her sacrifice deepens. The nights become endless, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, yet she rises at every sound of crying. She soothes with lullabies whispered in the dark, rocking fragile dreams into calm. The world does not often see this kind of love because it hides in small, ordinary moments. A bowl of warm soup placed before you when you're sick. A blanket pulled up quietly while you sleep. A hand brushing your hair back as if to say without words, "You are my world." Buddhism often speaks of compassion as the very heart of practice. If you wish to understand compassion, look into the eyes of a mother. Her love is the living example of boundless kindness, the kind that expects nothing in return. She does not measure how much she has given, nor does she demand repayment. She simply loves over and over again without condition. And yet, how easy it is for a child to overlook this, to roll their eyes at reminders, to grow impatient with her questions, to feel suffocated by her constant care. What we call nagging is often nothing more than love in disguise. What we dismiss as worry is simply the heart's inability to stop caring. There is a saying in Buddhist texts, "Of all the debts in this world, none is greater than the debt to one's mother." Imagine her years of carrying, nursing, protecting, teaching. How can such a debt ever be repaid? Not with wealth, not with gifts, not even with words alone. It can only be honored with presence, with kindness, with gratitude woven into daily life. But here lies the tragedy of forgetting. Too often, the mother's love is taken for granted until the house grows silent, until the kitchen is empty, until no one waits at the door. Only then does the child remember the warmth they once resisted. Only then do they realize that her embrace was not forever. It was a fleeting blessing, like morning dew that vanished while they were too busy chasing the sun. So listen carefully. A mother's heart is endless, but her time in this world is not. Do not wait for absence to teach you the value of presence. Do not let her love become just a memory, when it could still be a living bond. And as we journey further into this story, we will begin to see how blindness to such love leads to the greatest tragedy of all, the moment when the child, grown and proud, begins to turn away. There comes a time in many children's lives when the tender arms that once felt like safety begin to feel like chains. The voice that once sang lullabies becomes, in their ears, an endless stream of complaints. The sacrifices that raised them fade into the background of memory, and the very people who gave them everything begin to feel like an inconvenience. This is the blindness of the son, not a blindness of the eyes, but of the heart. The son grows taller, his shoulders broadening, world expanding. He steps out into life, chasing ambition, freedom, pleasure. And in that pursuit, he forgets the two figures who quietly step back to give him space. Their calls become interruptions. Their advice feels outdated. Their love begins to feel heavy, as though it is holding him back. One evening, the father asks a simple question: "When will you come home for dinner?" The son sighs, impatient. He mutters something about being busy, about having no time. To him, it is just a small annoyance, but to the father, it is the silence of a house waiting too long for laughter to return. Another day, the mother reminds him to eat properly, to take care of his health. He snaps back. "Stop worrying, I'm not a child anymore." He doesn't see the way her heart cracks a little at those words. He doesn't notice the way she turns away quickly, hiding the hurt behind a faint smile. This is how love slowly turns into burden, not because love has changed, but because the heart that receives it has grown blind. Buddhist teachings tell us that ignorance, avidya, is the root of suffering, and here, ignorance takes the form of forgetfulness. Forgetting the nights when his father walked home under the rain, carrying food so the child would never go hungry. Forgetting the mornings when his mother, though feverish, still rose to prepare his meal. Forgetting that his very existence is woven from countless acts of devotion. Instead, he convinces himself that he is self-made, that his success belongs only to him. He looks at his parents not as the foundation of his being, but as obstacles to his independence. But what is independence without gratitude? What is success if it costs the very hearts that raised you? There is a piercing irony in this blindness. The parents who once carried the child as their greatest joy now become the weight he wishes to shed. He doesn't see that every word of impatience, every door closed too quickly, every call unanswered is another stone laid on the path of regret he is building for himself. One day, he will look back and realize that love was never the burden. The burden was his own pride, his own blindness. And as the story continues, we will begin to see the quiet suffering of the parents, tears shed in silence, hearts breaking softly while still refusing to stop loving. The house that once echoed with laughter now sits in silence. The chairs at the dining table remain empty long after meals are prepared. The parents wait, night after night, for a knock on the door, a call on the phone, even a brief visit that never comes. Loneliness is not loud. It does not shout. It does not announce itself. It slips in quietly, like a shadow at dusk, filling the empty corners of a home once alive with the sounds of family. The father, once strong as a mountain, now moves slowly, his steps uncertain. He sits by the window, staring out at the road, hoping to catch a glimpse of the son he raised with so much sacrifice. Each passing stranger stirs a brief flicker of hope, but the road remains empty, and so does his heart. The mother, her hands weaker now, still prepares the dishes her son used to love. She lays the food on the table, as if he might appear at any moment. But as the food grows cold, she quietly clears it away, hiding her disappointment behind a weary smile. When no one is watching, a single tear slips down her cheek. This is the silent suffering of parents. They do not demand, they do not reproach. Their love endures even in neglect, even in absence. They will wait forever if they must, because in their hearts the door to their child is never closed. Buddhism teaches us of impermanence, anicca. All things change. The parents who once carried us with strength and energy will one day be frail. The voices that once guided us will grow soft and trembling. The arms that once lifted us high will eventually struggle to hold even themselves. And yet, too often, the child does not see this change until it is too late. Too absorbed in his own pursuits, he forgets that time is not standing still. With every passing day, the hair of his parents grows wider, their backs bend lower, their hearts grow heavier with waiting. One night, the father coughs violently in the quiet house. The mother rushes to his side, her frail hands trembling as she tries to comfort him. They lean on each other, fragile yet unyielding, whispering comfort even as both hearts ache for the son who is absent. In that moment, love does not diminish. It grows even deeper, even through sorrow. This is the tragedy of unspoken love. Parents hide their pain so their children do not feel guilty. They cry in silence so their tears will not become a burden. They pretend everything is fine when inside their hearts are breaking. And still, they love. Still, they wait. Because for them, the greatest joy is not wealth, not comfort, not even their own health. The greatest joy is simply the presence of their child. But the silence of the house grows heavier each day. And soon, that silence will no longer be filled with waiting, but with farewell. There comes a moment when time runs out. The house that once waited in silence now holds a deeper stillness, the stillness of farewell. The father, once strong as stone, lies weak upon his bed. His breath is shallow, each rise and fall of his chest more fragile than the last. The mother, weary and trembling, sits at his side, holding his hand as though her grip might keep him here a little longer. The son arrives too late. He rushes into the room, his heart pounding, but the weight of years of absence presses down on him. He sees his father's face, pale and lined with suffering, his mother's eyes swollen from sleepless nights. And for the first time in his life, he feels the crushing truth. The people who once stood unshakable before him are now slipping away. The father turns his eyes toward him. No anger, no reproach, only love. In those tired eyes is a lifetime of sacrifice, a lifetime of quiet endurance. And then, as his lips struggle to form words, a single tear escapes. It glides slowly down his weathered cheek, carrying with it the weight of everything left unsaid. It is not a tear of resentment. It is not even a tear of disappointment. It is love, pure, unconditional, unbreakable, even in the face of death. But hidden within it is sorrow too. Sorrow that he will leave before hearing the words he longed for. Sorrow that his son will only awaken when there is no time left to change. The son grasps his father's hand, trembling, desperate. He whispers, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." The words choke in his throat, heavy with years of neglect, but the father cannot answer now. His breath fades, the tear remains. The mother weeps softly beside him, her own heart breaking, yet even in grief she strokes her son's back as though comforting the very child who caused her deepest pain. Such is a mother's love, it does not stop, even in the shadow of loss. And in that room, silence falls once more. Not the silence of waiting, but the silence of goodbye. Buddhism teaches us that life is fleeting, like a candle flickering in the wind. We know this truth in words, but only in moments like this does it pierce us like a blade. For the son, the truth arrives too late. The chance to care, to speak, to show gratitude, gone in a breath. What remains is the memory of that final tear, a tear that will haunt him for the rest of his life, a tear that whispers endlessly, "Love me while I am still here. Do not wait until my body turns to dust. Do not wait until the house is empty and your words echo only in your own heart." The final goodbye is not just an ending. It is a mirror held up to us all. Will we recognize love before it is gone? Or will we too be left with nothing but regret? And as the story continues, we will witness the son's awakening, the crushing weight of realization that arrives too late, yet still has the power to change the way we live, if only we are willing to see. The room is quiet now. The father's breath has stilled. The mother's sobs have softened into a broken rhythm of grief. But in the son's heart, a storm rages. He falls to his knees beside the bed, clutching the sheets as if he could somehow hold on to what has already slipped away. For the first time, he feels the weight of everything his parents gave him. The nights they stayed awake when he was sick. The years they worked their bodies to the bone so he could live with ease. The countless acts of love hidden behind silence. And for the first time, he sees the cruelty of his blindness. Regret crashes over him like waves. Why didn't I answer their calls? Why did I roll my eyes at their words? Why did I believe there would always be more time? Each memory stings like fire, and yet nothing burns more than the realization that he can never make it right. He takes his father's lifeless hand and presses it against his forehead. Tears stream down his face, but it is too late. No apology, no words of love, no desperate cry can reach the ears of the one who is gone. The mother, though drowning in her own sorrow, lays her trembling hand on her son's shoulder. Her voice, weak yet steady, whispers, "Your father loved you. He always did." Even in her grief, she shields him, carrying the burden of comfort when she is the one most in need of it. The son's awakening comes not as a moment of peace, but as a wound ripped open. He sees clearly now, but clarity arrives too late. The chance to repay, to care, to show gratitude, it has vanished with his father's final breath. Buddhist teachings speak of karma, not as punishment, but as the natural consequence of our actions and neglect. The seeds we plant in moments of ignorance will one day ripen into fruit, bitter or sweet. For the son, his fruit is bitter regret. And yet, even in this despair, there is a seed of transformation. For the pain of awakening, though sharp, can open the door to wisdom. In the silence of that night, he vows to himself, "I will not let my mother leave this world carrying the same sorrow. I will not let my father's final tear be in vain. I will change. I must change." But deep in his heart, one truth will never fade. No matter how much love he gives from this day forward, it will never repay what has already been lost. His father's sacrifice is a debt beyond repayment. His awakening, though sincere, will always carry the shadow of regret. This is the cruel paradox of love unacknowledged. Once the chance is gone, it never returns. Yet it is also the gift of awakening, the power to change how we live, how we love, and how we honor those who remain. The son has awakened, but his journey has only begun. To understand the path forward, he must look beyond his pain and into the wisdom of the teachings that have guided countless lives. The teachings of the Buddha on the sacred duty of filial piety. In the quiet after grief, the son begins to seek answers. His heart aches with regret, but somewhere within that pain rises a question older than time itself. What does it truly mean to honor one's parents? For this, we must turn to the wisdom of the Buddha. In the vast ocean of Buddhist teachings, filial piety, gratitude toward one's parents, stands as one of the highest virtues. It is not simply a cultural tradition, nor just a moral duty. It is the very foundation of compassion, the training ground for the heart. The Buddha once said that if you carried your father on one shoulder and your mother on the other for 100 years, feeding them, bathing them, tending to their every need, you still would not repay the debt of their kindness. Why? Because the gift of life, of nurture, of unconditional love is beyond measure. It is a debt that cannot be erased, only honored. The Ulambana Sutra tells the story of Maudgalyayana, one of the Buddha's greatest disciples, who discovered through his spiritual vision that his deceased mother had fallen into the realm of hungry ghosts due to her past actions. Out of deep devotion, he tried to offer her food and water, but the offerings turned to fire before reaching her. Heartbroken, he sought guidance from the Buddha. The Buddha taught him that only through collective merit, acts of generosity and compassion dedicated not only to one's parents, but to all beings, could his mother be liberated. From this teaching was born the tradition of Ulambana, or Vu Lan, a festival honoring the boundless debt of parents. This is the essence of filial piety in Buddhism, to see our parents not only as individuals, but as the living embodiment of compassion itself. To care for them is to practice gratitude, but to expand that gratitude into the world is to truly honor their love. Think of it this way. When we speak kind words, when we act with compassion, when we live with mindfulness, we are repaying our parents, not only by easing their lives directly, but by showing that their sacrifices were not in vain, that their love gave rise to goodness in the world. Yet, how often do we forget? We imagine that success is enough to honor them. We believe that wealth, gifts, or achievements can repay their love. But the teachings remind us, what parents long for most is not riches or glory. It is the simple warmth of presence, the sound of their child's voice, the assurance that love flows both ways. Filial piety, then, is not only about grand gestures. It is about sitting beside them when they are lonely, listening when they repeat the same story again and again, offering a smile, a touch, a word of gratitude before it is too late. And when they have passed, filial piety does not end. We honor them through prayers, through acts of kindness dedicated to their memory, through living lives of integrity that reflect the values they instilled in us. For the son in our story, the Buddha's teachings shine like a lantern in the darkness. Though he cannot undo the past, he can transform his regret into compassion. He can care for his mother with the devotion he once withheld. He can honor his father's memory by living with gratitude, by making his life an offering of love. This is the deeper lesson. Filial piety is not a burden nor a chain. It is liberation. For when we open our hearts to gratitude, we break free from the prison of selfishness. We discover that to love our parents is to awaken to love itself, a love that stretches beyond family, beyond self, into the boundless compassion the Buddha taught. And so, the son begins to see a way forward. But knowing the teaching is not enough. The question remains, how do we live this gratitude in the rhythm of everyday life before the clock runs out again? Gratitude is not meant to live in memory alone. It is not a flower placed on a grave when the soil has already closed over our loved ones. It is a seed that must be planted and nurtured while the heart still beats and the hands are still warm. The Buddha's wisdom reminds us, if we wait until tomorrow, tomorrow may never come. So the question is, how can we weave gratitude into the fabric of our daily lives, so that love is expressed before regret is born? The answer is not found in grand offerings or elaborate ceremonies, but in small, consistent acts of presence. Gratitude lives in the ordinary. It begins in the morning with a simple phone call to ask how our parents slept. It lives in the pause at the dinner table, where instead of scrolling through screens, we look into their eyes and listen, truly listen, to the stories they tell. It thrives in moments when we step aside from our busy schedules to accompany them on a quiet walk or to share a cup of tea without rushing. Each act is a prayer, each gesture a silent vow. I see you. I remember your sacrifices. I carry your love within me. The son in our story, though late to awaken, begins to practice this truth. He learns that gratitude is not only spoken, it is lived. He offers help not because his parents demand it, but because his heart calls for it. He listens with patience, knowing that the sound of their voices is a gift that time will one day take away. He learns to bow inwardly each time he remembers the hands that once held him when he was small. For us, too, there are ways to make gratitude real. Words of appreciation. Not waiting for birthdays or farewells, but saying thank you now while they can hear it. Acts of service. Helping with small tasks. Easing their burdens without being asked. Presence. Sitting with them in silence, letting love be felt in the quiet companionship of shared space. Dedication. Offering our merits, whether through meditation, charity, or acts of kindness, with the wish that our parents be well, happy, and free from suffering. In Buddhism, to honor our parents is also to live as their continuation. Their kindness flows through our veins, their sacrifices echo in our lives. When we cultivate compassion for others, when we treat strangers with respect, when we live in integrity, we extend their love beyond themselves. We turn gratitude into a living river that nourishes not just our family, but all beings. And perhaps this is the most profound truth. Practicing gratitude is not only for the benefit of our parents, but for the healing of our own hearts. When we give thanks, we break the cycle of selfishness. When we care for them, we soften the hardness of regret. We transform the weight of obligation into the lightness of love. Imagine, for a moment, looking into your parents' eyes today, knowing that no words have been left unsaid, no kindness left undone. Imagine carrying that peace with you instead of the sting of remorse. That is the gift of gratitude practiced now, before it is too late. As the story nears its end, the son realizes that gratitude is not a chapter to be closed, but a way of living that stretches forward, moment by moment. Yet the question still lingers like a final breath. What happens when the chance is lost? when the last goodbye has already been spoken. There are stories that end with silence, and there are stories that end with a single tear. The tale of the ungrateful son is not just about regret. It is about the voice hidden inside that tear, a voice calling out to every heart that still has time. A tear falls when words are no longer enough, when the soul aches with what could have been said, what could have been done. That tear carries the weight of longing, but also a message: do not wait. Buddhism teaches us that life is fleeting, fragile as morning dew. Parents age while we are distracted. Their hair whitens, their backs bend, their steps slow, yet so often we remain blind until the chair they once sat in is empty. The tear of regret, then, is not meant to drown us, it is meant to awaken us. It whispers, if your parents are still here, love them now, not tomorrow, not someday. Sit with them, thank them, forgive and be forgiven. Each moment is an open door, and once closed, it never returns. And if they are gone, do not despair. Let your gratitude become a bridge. Dedicate your kindness to their memory. Live in such a way that your life becomes an offering, showing that their love flows on through you. In this way, no act of love is ever truly lost. The call of a tear is a call to awaken, to see beyond selfishness, beyond busyness, beyond pride. It is a call to return to the most ancient truth, that love, once given, never dies. It only waits for us to recognize it, to honor it, to let it guide us. So as this story closes, let us not carry it as mere words, but as a mirror. Look into it and ask yourself, have I spoken my gratitude today? Have I eased their burden even in a small way? Have I let them know that their love still lives in me? If the answer is no, then the time is now. Because life is not measured by how long we wait, but by how quickly we awaken. The son's tear may have come too late for him, but for us, can be the beginning. A tear is not only sorrow, it is also a seed. And if we let it fall into the soil of our lives, it can grow into compassion, into presence, into love that outlives us all. This is the call of a tear, to live without regret, to honor before loss, to love while love can still be felt. And as the Buddha taught, the greatest offering we can ever make is not incense, not gold, not even words, but a heart awakened to gratitude. The story has ended, but your story, the one written with every choice, every breath, every act of love, that story begins now. If this story touched your heart, let it be more than just a tale you listened to. Carry it with you, live it. And if the message of compassion and wisdom speaks to you, I invite you to walk further with us. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom for more teachings that awaken the heart, stories that nourish the soul, and reflections that remind us of what truly matters. Share this video with someone who may need the reminder today, and together, let us spread love, mindfulness, and gratitude. Because every moment is an opportunity to awaken, and sometimes all it takes is a single story to begin. If this story touched your heart, let it be more than just a tale you listened to. Carry it with you, live it. And if the message of compassion and wisdom speaks to you, I invite you to walk further with us. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom for more teachings that awaken the heart, stories that nourish the soul, and reflections that remind us of what truly matters. Share this video with someone who may need the reminder today, and together, let us spread love, mindfulness, and gratitude. Because every moment is an opportunity to awaken, and sometimes all it takes is a single story to begin.